Look at this pill, it is a beautiful shade of sapphire blue. To Martha Higgins, it looked like a miracle. To me, it looked like $19,000 in tax-free profit. Martha was an ICU nurse in Dayton, Ohio. She spent 40 years on the front lines, smart enough to smell a lie a mile away. But when you are staring at a terminal diagnosis and a bank account that cannot cover the cure without robbing your grandkids' future, you see what you want to see. I did not just sell her hope, I sold her a death sentence compressed into sugar and industrial dye. She thought she was beating the system, saving $3,000 a month while she fought for her life. Instead, she spent 6 months swallowing chalk while the tumors spread to her liver, her lungs, and her spine. My name is Leo Vance. I was her lifeline. I was her killer. And I am going to tell you exactly how I did it. The silence in the oncology office at Grandview was the loudest thing Martha had ever heard. She sat there in that navy quilted vest, her nursing intuition screaming that something was wrong, while her heart begged for a miracle. She had vetted me. She had scrutinized those forged FDA seals and pixelated signatures on the certificates ID emailed her. I used her own professional pride against her. I made her feel like she was the only one smart enough to find the secret cure the system was hiding. But you can't cure stage 4 with blue food coloring and powdered chalk. When the oncologist finally spoke, he didn't use the word remission. He used the word zero. 0 drug serum levels in her blood. The MRI looked like a map of a conquered territory, metastatic lesions lighting up her liver, her lungs, and her spine like a goddamn Christmas tree. I remember reading her final message, the one where she thanked me for giving her a chance even as she struggled to breathe. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I just felt annoyed that the industrial blue dye was starting to stain my fingers during the pressing process. To a predator, a nurse has specialized knowledge isn't a shield, it has a handle. I grabbed it and twisted. While she was planning her grandkids' college funds, I was planning my next luxury. Martha spent her final weeks paralyzed, her spine crumbling under the weight of a disease I'd even paid $19,000 to ignore. I didn't just take her money. I took her dignity, her time, and her breath. And back then, I thought she was the lucky one. At least her suffering had an end date. Mine was just getting started. People think scammers look for the weak. They don't. They look for the desperate who think they're too smart to be fooled. When I first saw Martha Higgins' profile, I didn't see a victim. I saw a challenge. She was a retired ICU nurse from Dayton, Ohio, 40 years of high-pressure medical experience. She knew the difference between a life-saving intervention and a death rattle. But she had one fatal flaw. She was a grandmother who loved her family more than she loved her own life. She had stage 4. And the American healthcare system was ready to bill her for every last cent of her grandchildren's college fund. That's where I stepped in. I wasn't Leo Vance back then. I was Dr. Julian Vance of MedCore Global Pharmaceuticals. I wore the crisp white coat, the stethoscope, and the practiced, weary smile of a man who was tired of the system failing patients. I didn't reach out to her with a miracle. I reached out with a logical, clinical alternative. I told her Grandview Medical Center had a back-channel program for life-saving immunotherapy drugs that hadn't cleared the final layer of red tape yet. I knew she'd do her homework. I wanted her to. I spent weeks crafting the PDFs. I didn't just slap a logo on a page. I forged FDA seals. I used pixelated signatures from real administrators. And I created lot numbers that looked like they belonged in a federal database. I knew an ICU nurse would check the certificates of authenticity. I gave her exactly what her professional eyes expected to see. When we spoke, she asked me about bioavailability and drug serum levels. I answered her with the cold, clinical precision ID memorized from stolen medical journals. I wasn't selling her a pill. I was selling her the idea that she was outsmarting a corrupt industry. She felt like a conspirator in her own survival. Every time she sent that wire transfer for $3,200, she thought she was saving a piece of her family's future. She thought she was being pragmatic. I watched those transfers hit my account and I didn't feel a shred of remorse. To me, Martha wasn't a person with a heart-shaped face and a lavender cardigan. She was just a high-yield asset. I was providing a service. I gave her 6 months of hope. I let her believe she was getting better while she sat in her quiet house in Dayton, swallowing nothing but compressed sugar and blue food coloring. I looked at her medical history and I didn't see a tragedy. I saw a roadmap for how much I could bleed her dry before the clock ran out. I wasn't just a scammer. I was a professional and I was damn good at my job. I knew the chalk would never cure her, but as long as the checks cleared, I let her die believing she won. I look at this pill vial now and I see a murder weapon, but back then I saw a business model. Martha Higgins wasn't a mark to me. She was a challenge, a 64-year-old retired ICU nurse from Dayton, Ohio. She'd spent 40 years in the belly of the beast, seeing the way the American medical system chews people up and spits them out when their insurance runs dry. She was pragmatic, she was sharp, and most importantly, she was terrified of what her illness would do to her family's future. I created Dr. Julian Vance because people like Martha Don T trust salesmen. They trust credentials. They trust the crisp white lab coat, the stethoscope draped just so, and the sterile, boring logo of MedCore Global Pharmaceuticals. I spent weeks perfecting that PDF with the forged FDA seal. I made sure the signatures were just pixelated enough to look like they'd been scanned through a dozen bureaucratic offices. I wasn't selling a cure yet, I was selling a doorway. When I first reached out to her, I didn't use a generic script. I used her own professional history. I told her MedCore was running a restricted access trial for an immunotherapy drug, that the big box hospitals were gatekeeping behind a $50,000 a month paywall. I knew she was worried about her grandkids' college fund. I knew she'd rather die than watch that money disappear into a corporate bottom line. That was my hook. I offered her a way to stay alive without bankrupting her legacy. The first time we spoke on the phone, she didn't just say yes. She grilled me. This is what people don't get. The smart ones are the easiest to kill once you speak their language. She asked me about the drug's half-life. She asked about the cytochrome P450 metabolism in the liver. I had the answers ready, pulled straight from the medical journals I'd stayed up all night memorizing. Every time I gave her a clinical cold response, I could hear her guard dropping over the line. She thought she was vetting me. She thought her 40 years of nursing were her shield, but I was just using her knowledge to build a tighter noose. I told her I could get it to her for $3,200 a month, a fraction of the retail price. I watched her calculate the math in her head, the savings, the years she'd get to see her grandkids grow, the pride of outsmarting the system. She felt like she was part of an elite underground, and I let her believe it. I didn't see a woman dying of cancer. I saw a monthly subscription to my lifestyle. I told her, welcome to the program, Martha. You're in good hands now. And as I hung up the phone in my loft looking out at the city lights, I didn't feel a single drop of guilt. I just felt like a winner. I wasn't the one who gave her cancer, I told myself. I was just the one who gave her a way to pay for it that made sense to her. If I didn't take her money, someone else would. That's how the world works. I wasn't a predator. I was just another provider in a crowded market. I didn't care that the medicine didn't exist. I cared that she felt better for having bought it. That was the service I provided. Hope isn't free, and in Martha's case, it cost exactly $3,200 a month. You think a nurse is the hardest person to fool. You think 40 years in the ICU makes a woman bulletproof, like she has seen enough blood and bureaucracy to spot a lie from a mile away. You're wrong. Experience isn't a shield, it's a map. It told me exactly where her blind spots were. Martha wasn't some naive grandmother looking for a miracle cure in a crystal shop. She was a scientist of the bedside. She was pragmatic, and that was my favorite part of the game. I didn't have to trick her into believing in magic. I just had to trick her into believing in math. I didn't send her a flashy flyer with a cure for cancer headline, that S for the amateurs. I sent her a technical white paper. I created MedCore Global Pharmaceuticals because the name sounded like every other faceless entity that bleeds Americans dry. I didn't approach her as a salesman. I approached her as a resource coordinator from Grandview Medical Center. I used the jargon she'd spent her life perfecting. I talked about drug serum levels, molecular bioequivalency, and Tier 4 specialty medication distribution. I spoke her language so she'd stop listening to her gut. I knew if I could make the paperwork look tedious enough, she'd believe it was official. Every month, I'd send her a certificate of authenticity via email. I spent hours on those PDFs. I didn't just slap a forged FDA seal on there. I made sure it looked like it had been scanned 4 times, slightly tilted, with the kind of pixelated signatures you see on real government documents. I knew she'd zoom in. I knew she'd look for the batch numbers, so I gave her real batch numbers from legitimate shipments, numbers I'd lifted from medical waste records. I weaponized her own diligence. I made her feel like she was the one doing the vetting, which made her more certain she was right. It's the ultimate high, convincing a smart person they've outsmarted a corrupt system. Then came the pills. I picked a specific shade of blue. Everything in the pharmaceutical world is color-coded to make you feel something. Blue means calm, blue means professional, blue means this will save you. I bought a hand-cranked pill press and a bucket of industrial food coloring. It was just compressed sugar and powdered chalk. That's it, no active ingredients, no poison either. I wasn't trying to kill her faster. I just needed her to stay alive long enough to keep the payments coming. When she called me after the first week and told me she felt clearer, I didn't laugh. I didn't feel a pang of conscience. I just nodded through the phone and told her the titration was working exactly as the lab predicted. I told myself that the placebo effect was the only real medicine she was ever going to get, and in a way I was doing her a favor. I'd tell myself, Leo, she is dying of metastatic cancer regardless of what you do. The system already failed her. If I wasn't taking her money, the hospital would be taking her house. Under my care, she at least died with the peace of mind that she wasn't draining her grandchildren's college fund. I gave her 6 months of false hope, and in exchange I got to pay the lease on a loft with a view of the city. People call that a scam. I called it a consulting fee for a graceful exit. The more she trusted me, the more I refined the noose. I'd call her late at night to check her vitals over the phone, making her read me her blood pressure numbers. I'd make up some bullshit about how the meds were stabilizing her vascular resistance. I could hear the relief in her voice, that shaky, exhausted sigh of a woman who thought she'd finally found a way out of the trap. I knew exactly which keys to hit to keep her silent. I told her the hospital would kick her out of her current treatment if they knew she was using an unauthorized international trial. I turned her own medical team into the enemy and made myself her only ally. I wasn't just taking her money. I was taking her reality, and I felt like a god for doing it. I was the one who controlled whether she had a good day or a bad one, and all it cost me was a few cents worth of chalk. The end of the game usually happens in a room that smells like floor wax and bad coffee. For Martha, it was a small exam room at Grandview Medical Center. She'd gone in for what she thought was going to be her victory lap. She'd been on my protocol for 6 months. She felt tired, sure, but she attributed that to the medicine fighting the war inside her. I'd told her that the fatigue was a sign of efficacy. I'd told her that the sharp pains in her back were localized inflammatory responses indicating the drug was targeting the bone lesions. I had an answer for every symptom. I didn't just sell her pills. I sold her a narrative where her body's failure was actually a success. She sat there in that navy blue quilted vest, her silver gray bun perfectly neat, probably holding her silver locket and thinking about how she'd outsmarted the system to save her family's money. Then the oncologist walked in. He didn't have the warm, trustworthy smile I used in my profile pictures as Dr. Julian Vance. He looked sick to his stomach. He had the results of the blood panel and the new MRI. He told her the drug serum levels were non-existent. There was no medicine in her blood, not a trace. Not a single molecule of the $40,000 a year treatment she thought she was getting for discount. Then he put the scans on the light box. That was the moment the floor dropped out. In 6 months, while she was diligently swallowing my chalk and sugar, the cancer had staged a full-scale invasion. It wasn't just in her breast anymore. It was a cluster in her liver. It was peppering her lungs like buckshot. It had wrapped itself around her spine, ready to snap her in half. She wasn't just sick anymore, she was a walking ghost. The $19,000 she paid me had bought the cancer a 6-month head start, and the cancer didn't waste a single second of it. The doctor asked to see the bottle. Martha, being a nurse, kept meticulous records. She pulled out the vial I'd sent her. I can only imagine the look on that oncologist's face when he saw the forged FDA seal I'd spent 20 minutes perfecting on Photoshop with pixelated signatures. He had the lab run a quick analysis on the remaining capsules. They found exactly what I'd put in there: compressed sugar, powdered chalk, and industrial-grade blue food coloring. The kind of dye they use for plastic toys, not medicine. The betrayal wasn't just that I took her money. It was that I used her own 40 years of ICU experience to hang her. She vetted me. She asked the right questions. She looked for the red flags, but I knew exactly what a nurse wanted to hear. I used the medical jargon. I used the clinical tone. I weaponized her professionalism against her. I made her feel like we were two experts working outside a broken system. In reality, she was the prey and I was the predator. Watching her bleed out through a spreadsheet while I paid the lease on my luxury loft. When the oncologist told her she was terminal, that there was nothing left to do but manage the pain, she didn't scream. That's the thing about people like Martha. They just go quiet. She realized in that moment that she'd spent her grandchildren's future on a bag of sugar and a lie. She realized that every victory we celebrated over the phone was just me laughing while I checked my bank balance. I didn't feel a shred of remorse when the news reached me. I just wondered if I had time to close the bank account before the authorities caught the scent. To me, Martha wasn't a tragedy. She was just a very successful quarter. The blood work is where the theater ends and the morgue begins. Martha walked into that oncologist's office in Dayton thinking she was a miracle. She felt exhausted, sure, but she'd been told to expect that. I was the one who told her. I told her the fatigue was a sign the MedCore inhibitors were winning the cellular war. I told her that her body was diverting every ounce of energy to the healing process. I used her own nursing background against her, feeding her just enough clinical theory to make her own decline feel like progress. Imagine the look on the oncologist's face when he pulled up the lab results. He was looking at a woman who had spent nearly $20,000 on what she believed was a cutting-edge protocol. But the blood panel didn't just show the cancer was active. It showed a drug serum level of 0, not low, not insufficient, 0. In the eyes of the science she had trusted her entire life. Martha Higgins hadn't been taking any medicine at all. She'd been fasting on a diet of pure deception. Then came the MRI. This is the part where people usually expect me to show some shred of regret, but you have to understand the logistics. To me, those images were just the expiration date on a high-yield account. The scans didn't show a managed condition. They showed a wildfire. The liver was peppered with lesions that weren't there 6 months ago. The lungs were clouding over. The spine was being eaten away, vertebra by vertebra. While I was emailing her those certificates of authenticity with the forged FDA seals and the pixelated signatures, the cancer was using that time to colonize every vital inch of her. I had sold her the one thing a terminal patient can afford to waste: time. She called me from the parking lot after the appointment. Her voice didn't have that ICU authority anymore. It was thin. Like paper being shredded. She didn't scream. She didn't even ask for the money. She just whispered, "Julian, the doctor says there's nothing in my blood. He says I am dying." What was in those pills? I sat there in my loft, looking at the same industrial blue food coloring I'd bought from a bakery supplier to make the chalk look professional, and I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The transaction was over. I just hung up and started the process of scrubbing the MedCore servers. When the police finally caught up to the physical evidence, they found the truth in a kitchen-grade pill press. It wasn't some complex chemical compound. It was compressed sugar and powdered chalk. The blue dye was the only thing that wasn't natural. She had spent 40 years saving lives in the ICU, and I ended hers with the same material you use to draw hopscotch squares on a sidewalk. People call it a tragedy. I look at the spreadsheet and see a $19,000 profit margin with almost zero overhead. The real discovery wasn't the cancer. It was how easy it is to kill someone who is too proud to admit they were being hunted. To Martha, those blue pills were a lifeline. To me, they were just a very efficient way to turn a nurse's pension into my lifestyle. Her death wasn't a failure of the product. It was the final stage of the business plan. She was a nurse for 40 years. She spent 4 decades in the ICU, the kind of woman who could spot a pulmonary embolism from across a hallway and tell you exactly which valve was failing before the machine even beeped. But she didn't see the rot coming from me. When the oncologist in Dayton finally sat her down, the room probably felt colder than the morgue. He had the blood panels in his hand. And he looked at her with a confusion that quickly turned into horror. 0 drug serum, absolute 0. For 6 months, Martha Higgins hadn't been fighting her cancer. She'd been feeding it sugar. I sat in my loft 3 states away, watching her desperate emails hit the MedCore servers. She'd tell me about the fatigue, the new pains in her side, and I'd just reply from the Dr. Julian Vance account, telling her it was a sign the targeted therapy was working. $19,260. That's the price of a life in this country when the legitimate pharmaceutical industry decides you're worth more dead than cured. I didn't make the real medicine cost $3,000 a month. I just offered a more affordable alternative. If that alternative was made of compressed chalk and industrial blue food coloring, does that really make me the villain? Or just a more efficient capitalist? By the time her MRI showed the metastatic lesions blooming like dark flowers across her liver, lungs, and spine, the game was already won. The too late wasn't just a medical diagnosis, it was the entire foundation of my business model. You see, by the time a patient realizes the miracle is a lie, they were usually too weak to fight back. This is your warning. If you think your professional expertise, your 40 years in a nursing uniform makes you bulletproof, you are exactly the person I am looking for. You think you're revetting the source, checking the forged FDA seals I perfected in Photoshop, but you're actually just convincing yourself to hand over your grandchildren's college fund. Martha wanted to save her family from the debt of her own death. Instead, she paid me 20 grand to watch her vanish. Look at the pill vial in my hand. It looks official. It feels heavy. It smells like a pharmacy. But the only thing inside is a death sentence wrapped in a blue dye. By the time you realize the difference, the line on the monitor has already gone flat, and IV already moved on to the next pension plan.